For me, coming from Ahmedabad, where we took the practitioner-teacher as almost a given, it was very nice to sort of hear about Professor Jhabwala in the context of Delhi and the SPA. And I must say, this sort of learning has influenced my own trajectory and perhaps my concerns in indirect ways. So with that tribute, I'm going to make this segue into my own experiences in a way I hope that will resonate the person that Professor Mathur sort of described. And I'm going to share with you some of my own work, but also my relationship with my city, the city of Mumbai, which has come to sort of influence me in terms of my own production as an architect working in India. And that has influenced my concerns and engagements, which are sort of triangulated, I believe, between the practice of architecture, urban design, conservation, and really deep interests in landscape architecture. So I've organized this talk and this presentation into two sections. I'm going to first share with you a few issues that have really been concerning me, and I think it kind of also resonates what in the profession we have almost to the center of our imaginations as architects, and issues that I think continually struggle with, and largely struggle with the idea of how one can articulate those issues, but also make them productive for us as designers. I mean, I think that really is the bridge that for me is immensely important. And in the second part, I'm going to focus on a series of projects which I'll describe and share with you in terms of their design logic and materiality. I think equity and social justice is perhaps going to be the most important issue for all of us as practitioners and professionals in the coming years. Because besides the disruptions that globalization has caused, it is the drive of capital that we all know has been detrimental to the values we brought to bear on our environments in its broadest way. And I think Renana alluded to my usage of the word of impatient capital, because I think a lot of what is being built is the architecture of impatient capital, which is driven by vendors. Capital is intrinsically impatient and has to manifest itself very quickly, and we're getting a very particular kind of architecture. A simple way to do it would be the dumb glass box. And so this impatience of architecture, in my mind, it's the free-running capitalism which will never help resolve this inherent contradiction about our aspirations to create, whether it's green buildings, sustainable environments, socially inclined and human environments, because as architects, we are simultaneously pandering to capital and the forms it demands, and that really limits the questions that we can even ask. As Wolfgang Streeck has said in his book titled, "How Will Capitalism Fail?" and to quote him, he says, "Capitalism can no longer turn private vice into public benefit. Its existing as a self-reproducing, sustainable, predictable, and legitimate social order has ended. Capitalism has become more capitalist than is good for it," unquote. Or, the fact that I'm not going to say much about this image, it's self-explanatory. That's happening in Mumbai. The fact that as a society we can even pander to that is amazing. And I think as professionals, we'll be judged by where our energies are invested. And I think this becomes a big challenge for the profession and the kind of values that we perpetuate through the built environment. And so I think really that's what we have to hold as professionals as the challenge. We're going to be judged by where our energies go. And right now our energies are going into the architecture of indulgence, whether it's indulging capital or it's indulging forms of hedonistic existence. Given the landscape that we exist in, I think that becomes a really important question. Spatial inequity is critical. As Charles Correa wrote, to quote him, "Today the amount of urban space one controls is directly proportionate to one's status or income. It has no connection to actual family size. In fact, poorer people often have larger families. This space differential, therefore, cannot be justified in human terms, only economic ones." Equity is not a quantitative measure. It also has a subjective dimension of access. Sometimes perceived access or an illusion of equity, perhaps, is also something that as designers we need to engage with. Plot divisions, the very fabric of the city, is a great contributor to this, and thus by extension, the form architecture takes. And I think this is where designers can play a role in modulating spatial possibilities for societies. It is, as Martha Chen advocates in the context of economy, and I'm going to quote Marty Chen. She says, quote, "What is needed most fundamentally is a new economic paradigm, a model of hybrid economy that embraces the traditional and the modern, the small scale and the big scale, the informal and the formal. What is needed is an economic model that allows the smallest units and the least powerful workers to operate alongside the largest units and the most powerful economies and economic players." The next issue I think that we should be confronting, or concerns me, is the notion of pluralism and coexistence. Because in addition, pluralism of form and its coexistence are inevitable in a democracy. And as are collisions between differing forms of urbanism and close adjacencies. Thus dissipating these polarities and softening thresholds between these disparate forms of urbanism are the essential design challenge, I believe, for a generation that's going to practice here. Facilitating the connections and networks between diverse forms is one way to promote these synergistic dependencies. The question that then comes to mind is, can borders be deconstructed and softened? Can boundaries be dissipated spatially? Could this become the basis for a rational discussion about coexistence? Or is the resulting urbanism that we are dealing with inherently paradoxical? Is the coexistence of these differing forms of urbanism and their respective states of physical utopia and dystopia inevitable? Can the spatial configuration of how this simultaneity occurs be formally imagined? Or is it inevitable that cities will be molded in a singular image, where architecture is that only remarkable spectacle of the city? We have made architecture central to being the spectacle of the city, and this is something we have to rethink. China has locked itself into that paradigm, but I think the Indian city challenges that as a paradigm where architecture is not the only spectacle of the city, and I think we see it in our everyday landscapes. So what I've described thus far is all our spheres of concern. How do we make productive overlaps between the spheres of our concern and the spheres of our direct or indirect influence? As architects, we are aware of and concerned with many issues, from the societal through the planetary scales, ranging from poverty and public health to urban violence and climate change. More often than not, our spheres of influence does not empower us to address any of these issues in a tangible manner, because these are completely differentiated. In the evenings, we live in the spheres of our concerns, and then every day we deal with another sphere of influence. They don't sort of overlap. And I think this is an important thing to think about. Entire disciplinary practices are in the danger of dissipating because they can't move beyond expressing and representing these concerns. So we can represent these concerns beautifully, but we don't know how to connect it to the sphere of our influence. But most importantly, these narratives illuminate the narrow sort of influence of architects, our territory of operation in the business as usual model of practice. It also sheds light on ways to better understand the site as mediated through and embedded within a larger scale of economic, social, and political processes. Through this broader scope, designers can, I believe, potentially have a more far-reaching, progressive social impact beyond the immediate sites of our project. Prem Chandrawaka once sort of shared this with me, and I think it's beautiful, which he says is, we are all concerned with the practice of architecture, but what is the architecture of practice? What is the form that your practice sort of takes? And it means defining the protocols in a different way. And so for us, one of the important things has been using books as an instrument to understand these meta-narratives, to understand the context of the context. And I think in retro, a lot of the books I sort of was engaged in vary from, you might call scholarly, but some of them are just catalogs. They are what I call instruments for advocacy, because we all want to engage with advocacy, but I think a big contribution designers can make is create the instruments for that advocacy, because often we have the will, because of the sphere of our concerns, to engage with advocacy, but we don't have the appropriate instruments to do that. The advocacy process and these instruments become very important. And our publications have become a way of also creating partnerships, collaborations, friendships, which serve to keep the conversation on issues and areas of engagement, because sometimes these go over decades and it keeps them alive. And then the publications go out into the world beyond the project and have a life of their own to perhaps expand, I hope, our sphere of influence. So finally, we don't have the agency, or if we don't find ways of having the agencies, to be instrumental as designers, as practitioners in this sort of world, I mean, I think we break down as a profession because we are finally judged by where we invest our energy as architects. And I think this is the crisis that the profession faces, in my opinion, today. And so this idea of zooming out also then led me to look at the Kumbh Mela, because I see the landscapes that we exist in, which are largely ephemeral, they're kinetic, as I call them. And so I wrote a lot about what I call the kinetic city, looking at Mumbai as a case, and then extended the kinetic to the ephemeral and the city to urbanism. And the Kumbh was the first project there. And this was very interesting because it was a project that went across 7 schools at Harvard University. And it was very interesting because it was such an out-of-the-box problem that no discipline had a preconception. So for me, it's one of the few truly interdisciplinary projects we've done, because for the public health, people were more useful in understanding this than the designers were. The designers were like ghabraud when they were told we're going to see and map a city that's going to house so many million people in such a short time. The 2 things that struck me the most that have stayed with me, one was that finally, after a year of analysis, I would say the entire Kumbh Mela is made out of 5 materials. It's a kit of parts. It's 8-foot-long bamboo, string or rope or wire, nails or screw, corrugated sheet or plastic or fabric, skinning material. If you took the corrugated sheet out and just said skinning material, you'd have 4 materials by which the entire Kumbh Mela is erected in 6 weeks from the time the river recedes. It's mind-blowing. And the reason that happens is because it's a kit of parts. And it's so intelligent that that kit of parts can give you a little tent. The red is the 8-foot bamboo. It gives you all these variations, including massive temples. So the variation, I mean, the kit of parts, although it's so simple, the complexity it can create potentially is pretty mind-boggling. Of course, this has evolved over centuries. The second thing that I found really mind-boggling, and this was done through very intense research, having the operators and the administrators come and spend days with us at the university, is that even its governance structures on a temporal scale. So what you see in different colors are the different hierarchies. And by the time the execution happens, the entire hierarchy shifts to the bottom half of the circle. And that person only reports to the chief minister or to one. What happens in our cities, actually, more than the physical form of our cities, the architecture that city is made for, it's our governance models that are more permanent. And these hinder many operations, because as cities become more complex, their form of contestation changes, their emergencies. That's why you can't respond to floods and things, because it's such a static, permanent governance system with strict hierarchies that it's not nimble like this. And so one can actually, so when we talk about temporary or ephemeral, it's not just the architecture, it's the spirit all the way down to the governance. And I think there's a lot of possibilities in understanding that. So talking about this, how does one take this further? This is at the Arsenale in the Venice Biennale. So we did a large installation there, which was also made by only the Kumbh Mela material, which began to take this out to the world, which led me to actually expand this research. And we took this as a model, and this is a new book that has just come out, which is called Ephemeral Urbanism: Does Permanence Matter? And here we've created a taxonomy and looked at 300 cases of celebration of religion, of strife, of disaster, of transactions, which are markets, of refuge, which are refugee camps, and these cases, and military, and looked at how can one as planners across these cases usefully extract the notion of time as an instrument that might inform the way we imagine our cities, or we make the space in our cities. So I'm not arguing for all our cities to be temporary, but I'm arguing that the temporal dimension, we have to find a way to create a matrix that can be put into the mainstream discussion about planning. Otherwise, it's going to be a binary of the informal and the formal. And this research, looking at the temporal dimension of cities, has made me question, in the context of India, what is really urban? Because in India, I would describe urbanization as incomplete, because our cities yet have ties with the rural. We don't have the safety nets of health and education. There is a flux here that is absolutely mind-boggling. And so we've been now looking at, this is how census classifications occur, which give us 7,000-something town. And I see my friend Partha there, who has also written beautifully on these sort of new urban sort of conglomerates that are emerging. But what we have done is try to spatialize this. And this is going to be published soon, not out yet. But what we've taken is the 3 census criteria, which is the census criteria of settlements with over 5,000 people. The second criteria, which is about density, 400 people per square kilometer. And the third criteria, 75% of the male population in non-agricultural employment. And so we've taken that and tried to understand what that means, because why are these sort of clubbed together? And if you start deconstructing that, you actually have a completely different map of urbanization. So that's just the map in comparison, which gives you a completely different geography. If you use the criteria of density, we have the world's biggest megacity that goes from Kashmir all the way to Kolkata and is about 200 kilometers wide. It's by any definition a megacity. And it's a different reading of urbanization. If you take the criteria of agricultural employment, male agricultural employment, the areas that are megacities don't even show up as towns. And so what is it that we are planning for? But what it's telling us is this notion of flux is something that we have to deal with, because not only is the urban and rural binary dissolving completely, but within this, you have a movement of people. And so you could argue that India, by the definition of the government, is 60% urban for 6 months of the year and 40% urban for the other 6 months of the year. So you have 300 million, I mean, I'm just saying this provocatively, loosely, but you have 300 million people who are in a state of flux, which means the parameters for housing, the kind of amenities, the urban spaces you need for economy, for the informal sort of work, changes completely, which means your imagination of planning has to change completely. And so I think we're trying to sort of find ways of spatializing this also in very clear locations. So, but this is just a caricature, so to speak, and I just use that to now loop back to architecture, because I'm supposed to show you projects too. And so this is how we understand the map usually. In terms of architecture, this was the original spine of architectural awareness, let's say, because this is also where the economy was situated, from Chandigarh, New Delhi, Ahmedabad, Baroda, Mumbai, Goa, because of Charles Correa's building, Pondicherry, with many foreign architects, but also Raymond doing the ashram, etc. In the new economy, this is the new axis. It's a completely different zone in terms of geography, but it's also a different set of protocols. You can't work without Vastu in any of these cities, for example. So the protocols are different, but also the aesthetic baggage is different. It's not the baggage of the aesthetics of modernism as we've known in the first generation of architecture. And that's why you see all sorts of bizarre things happening. And as these small towns grow, you're going to have colliding protocols and imaginations of what architectural representation should be. So protocols and processes become very critical. And so my other research, which looks at architecture, I think Renana alluded to these books, is trying to discern that. It's trying to see what is the architecture of practice? What are the different models of practice? And what are the protocols that go with that? And are they legitimate? So I began to, through my own experiences, understand this. And I found that what we have to do is, the client is not just this sort of mono kind of entity, but a client is a patron, an operational client, and a user client. These are different. In some projects, they collab. When you do a weekend house for some, when you do the architecture indulgence, usually all of these collapse into one person. And that's why you can craft beautiful things, because the control is very single. But in most projects, this gets unpacked, because sometimes the patrons have nothing to do with the users, and the operation client has nothing to do with anyone. So it's like completely fractured. And I think that's what makes the mainstream so hard to operate, or frustrating for us, that we have this sort of anxiety. So I'd like to sort of unpack it in a sense. It's patrons, clients, and users. And with that, I'm going to jump into some projects to share my experience. Mumbai, Delhi, farmhouses, weekend homes, we all do that. And we were recently asked, well, 2 years ago, to do a home, which you see here at the bottom. You see 3 squares and a rectangle. It's a home for Dr. Udwadia, who is the one who discovered drug-resistant TB. He wanted a villa, as most people want here. And it's at the edge of the village. And so the question is, how do you blur this? How do you also make a project out of this? And so we sort of bought the notion of incrementalism. That is, that how would we design a weekend house for a very wealthy person, but in a way that it also becomes a model that is incremental, that a middle-class person who might aspire to a house might be able to use it. So one of these units has the living room, the kitchen, the top one, in a courtyard, and then you have a pool and a study and a guest room, and then you have 3 rooms, which is the family. So it becomes one big house if just the family is together, the kids and the husband and wife, etc. But they're different. So someone could build this one at a time, for example. It need not take the same form, but it's about fragmenting the program. And then also, that has an implication on scale, because then it sits much more gently with the village around it, rather than this autonomous object that we'll end up creating if we pack and compress the program into one. And so the materials are all local, they're simple. It's a series of courtyards where light is modulated. You see the swimming pool there. We've made the pool very discreet because, again, that's a binary we set up through these pieces of indulgence because, you know, people are sunbathing and swimming, and while gardeners are toiling in the garden. How do you make this discreet in a way that you enjoy the luxury of a location like that, but it's discreet in ways these coexistences occur. And then this is the room which has blinds, but it can open out and become one big house, but it can also have the privacy of 3 different rooms. How do you imagine it in the rain and the monsoon? How do you catch the light? Those, of course, become very important here. Just a very thin copper flashing that picks up the sun, but also creates waterproofing. And we had no paintings in it, and it's the light through these windows that modulate on the ceiling as the sun goes around, and so the space keeps changing, makes you very aware also of the time of the day and the season, because the light changes in different seasons. And then, of course, the relationship with the outside. So in that case, you had a condition where the client, the user, the operational client, and the patron collapse, and you can craft it in a particular way. In projects like this is the Chaumala project, it was a bit detached because the users are people from the city, the inner city, who will use the museum. Clients are people we dealt with who were going to run the place, and the patron in this case was Princess Ezra, who was the Nizam's first wife. And of course, we tried to create the synergies, but then the processes become different. And here, what you see in red got encroached upon illegally, and so it was a question of stabilizing the 3 courtyards to create this public space of a museum. That was how we sort of got it. It was about measure drawings, which were all, I mean, I'm showing you all of this because, I mean, I think a practice, so for us here, measure drawings become very important. It, again, has an implication on time because the processes and the protocols are completely different. And how do you simultaneously engage with that kind of rigor while doing contemporary projects which have a completely different set of protocols? Condition drawings, a column like that takes 3 months to bring into a kind of finished form. It makes you kind of adjust your rhythms in completely different ways, and that's sort of the Darbar Hall where the entire ceiling was recreated. The museums with very minimal interventions, just a protective glass where you don't even see the clamps, but it allows the protection for the fabric. But with the budgets that we had, which were very low, it's a very simple museum. It doesn't have air conditioning or fancy lighting, but it's much more, exposure to the Nizam's legacy. In institutional buildings, of course, this begins to get more complex. In the Chaumala Palace, at least, there was a synergy because the patron was a very clear entity. And so in an institute, the users become students or office goers. The clients are, the committees that are set up, and the patron might be the head of, in this case, I'm going to show you the Sept University Library, the Ahmedabad Education Society, who, is detached from this process, but yet wants a good piece of architecture. So the role of the architect changes because you've got to then create equations around. If you recognize this, then you have to create equations at all 3 levels, rather than worry about just the client and be totally frustrated because the client is being determined by someone else and the users are someone else. And so that became different. And this was a very hard project, the hardest project I've ever done, which was trying to do an addition and the first non-Doshi building on the Sept campus, which was designed by Doshi, someone we all respected and learned from. And so it was a really hard task. And so it was a process that was very complex because in an architecture school, there are like 101 opinions when you have to do a building. So to negotiate that, we felt the best way to do it was through public discourse. And so we did a series of presentations. They were put up on YouTube. People reacted, and they were really helpful. I mean, one got a lot of inputs, but it was also about consensus building without making the compromises. I guess we made some compromises, but it was also about giving structure to the campus and things, which is yet in progress, so I won't talk about that. And what was difficult about this was the program that I got, it would have required a 6-storied building. And of course, one couldn't do that. So this was, for me, an intervention in a historic, heritage, contemporary complex. And so the decision we made was really to put the building underground, that is, put half the building 3 stories underground and not go a centimeter above Doshi's buildings, both out of respect, but also for the integrity, so to speak, of the complex. And so the building then was organized with the books in the stacks going into the earth, the heaviness, and going up were the reading rooms and places for interaction. And that's sort of an early model which sort of shows how that space goes. But the challenge was to bring light all the way down. So we've created a system, which I'll show you in a second, where the light comes all the way down. And so in section, it's quite a complex building. In the center is a core, which is the book stacks, which is like a big walk-in wardrobe, or that was the aspiration to engage with these sort of books. And then there are carrels and other spaces. And the upper area is light. It's in steel and shera board and gypsum board. So it's very light and dry construction, and it's wet construction below the ground. And that's how it sort of sits on the campus with this base. And the louvers modulate, so it's a skin that can be modulated, set on 6 settings for different parts of the facade. And it's going to be now used for students, for a class who will monitor this and actually learn from its sort of reflective input in terms of its climate. And then, of course, scale was a very important thing in how it sort of related to the other buildings, and then how you sort of entered the buildings through this sort of sense of porosity. And there you see the basement, which becomes visible. And it's on absolute access to Doshi's building, also as a way of respecting that axial connection to the library, which I hope it speaks to in a sense. And the ground floor is meant for public, juries, exhibitions, for students to meander in and out of. But the skin creates these sort of reflections at twilight, where you see the exhibition in there, you see bits of the building, and the light changes, so the porosity changes depending on the time. And then as you go below the building, it's concrete, and the color of the concrete becomes lighter to draw in light with the carrels that sit in these courtyards. And these courtyards will also have furniture and ferro cement and things where people can come out. And these are spaces where even if people made noise, they won't disturb the inside. And that's, you see the relation of the book stacks to the carrels. These are the carrels looking out, and these are that big walk-in wardrobe that I was referring to. So people who want to talk or chat, or there'll be furniture, they can step out into that courtyard without disturbing the library itself. And then, because sectionally there's a different logic for different components of the building, that many different sections become visible from the same given perspective. And for me, a good sign, I mean, to see a student sleeping there meant it was very comfortable. So here you're in the book stacks, and these are half levels that take you to different levels, and you see the simultaneity of many levels. So it goes down 12 meters, and you see 8 meters together at most times. And so you see the depth of the building, and there's a lot of porosity so that you don't have claustrophobia. You see the carrels at the bottom. There are layers in this, so you see through windows. And you see a room there, which is at a different level from those rooms, where you see the woman standing with the bag. And the idea was to sectionally make it modulated. And the light goes down these 2 levels. So when you open the louvers, it actually gets very bright. That's at 8 meters below the ground. Or you can modulate the louvers to keep the sun out and keep it very sort of cool. Yeah, so you see that. And then it's the structure of these portals. So you see no columns in the basement. The columns and the structure, the air conditioning, the electrical is all integrated in the book stack. So when you come in here, it's just these 3 portals that define the structure. They also define the zone for the tables, and the corners become meeting rooms. So the structure inherently organizes the space. And for me, what one tried to achieve here was silence, because I felt the upper floors, when you look out to the landscape, is you're communicating with nature, but here you're introspectively communicating with the book. So the aspiration was to create spaces, so to speak, of silence. And so as you go up, it's much more light, it's luminous, it's steel, it's glass. The glass can be very expansive because the sun doesn't touch it, because the louvers cut it off, and the louvers can be modulated. These will all also have furniture where people can sit, and it's a whole different sort of ambiance. These will have conference tables, so students can come out and do working groups without disturbing people inside. And then the louvers adjust, so you can adjust the louvers in panels of 4 and 6 to create different kinds of modulation. And this is being actually mapped scientifically by consultants and people, faculty there, so it'll become a manual to set it every 2 weeks for different times of the day. And the plinth becomes a place that people actually occupy, and students actually love it, and they sit around because it allows them to be inside and outside. And you have this play between very raw materials, in this case concrete, with more finished interiors which are more contemporary. One of the challenges here, which I understood wasn't made explicit in the brief, was how do we in a school of architecture expose students to contemporary materials but show more relevant, interesting, modulated uses of these materials in adjacencies to each other. So glass, of course, is important, and glass gives you lovely qualities, but the way it's used becomes important both from the climatic perspective, but also the aesthetic. In corporate buildings, you really don't need air conditioning. People put air conditioning, but they don't need it all the time. So to extend that, much later, we did a building in Hyderabad, which is also a hot, dry climate. It was for an infrastructure company in Cyberabad, the red site that you see. And this is a company called KMC, and they are very high-tech. This is like NASA's control room. They have, every truck has a camera, and they monitor who's doing what, and people report and pick up a cell phone and tell them to get back from their tea break. And so they wanted a glass box because that was infrastructure. And at that time, when I visited Hyderabad, the Telangana thing was at its peak, and I found this interesting thing, Mercedes-Benz. So anything that had global capital invested had fishing nets on it. And then I discovered that the guys who sell you Alico Bond and curtain glazing, they give you an option of fishing nets and details to attach it, because in a riot, these are the targets, and people stone these. And so it was interesting that these, we talk about impatient capital or these sort of compulsive sort of moves to have imagery like this, as I think Gautam Bhatia has described, this illusion of competency in the way we, to look competent in a sense, but have nothing to do with the reality. And so we were really disturbed by this, and we began at that time in Jaipur studying this hut, which the business community puts up there as a water cooler. They do it every summer. And that guy works for this association, and he puts this kettle out there. It's such a beautiful object. And then people come and drink water. It's clean, cool water. No paper cups, nothing that's thrown out or disposable. It's not only human, it's beautiful, it's sustainable, and it's mind-blowing, because he comes out every once in a while and he humidifies the water, the hut, so that through humidity and through evaporative cooling, it stays cool. And then within the hut, there are earthen pots, which also, as we all know, the matka always keeps water cool through evaporative cooling. So it's such a beautiful little kind of object that it inspired us tremendously. And we said we must do something that can try to bring this beauty and this adjacency of unknown people who smile, thank him, they maybe wink at him, but it's minimal contact, but rather beautiful. And so we did this building, which then became a 5-story high garden. It's not a green wall that's stuck, which people do, put pots like in our airports, and put green on it, but it's a performative skin. It's the cusp principle that we used in Delhi and other dry climates, where you keep it hot and have a fan blow on it. And so here, every facade then begins to have its own geometry, its own plants, which we tested in a nursery to see what would grow on what side of the facade. And every facade is different. The building is dynamic. You go at a different season. The flowers are there. They're not there. And also talking about impatient capital, the clients wanted this in 14 months, and we got them to agree that we would do the facade over the next 2 years. And by detaching it as an architectural element, we could do that. So the cows came in and made the building sacred. The pujas happened. And we took 2 more years to grow the facade. And the same contractors that had worked with Rajiv to fabricate those screens, we contacted them, and one of them set up a small business. And he said, if I can buy only one mold, because a mold is expensive, and you give me a year to build this, it's economic. So we used recycled alloys, from aluminum. So we mixed it because we wanted texture. We weren't concerned about any consistency. One mold is what was used to produce this. And it was a factory that this guy set up and has had a business that came out of it. It was not something that was intentional, but when I look back to it, I feel very happy about that as a fallout. And a lot of women are employed there. It's very light. 2 people carry it. It looks very heavy, but it's actually quite hollow. So 2 people can carry it, and 2 people take it when they're enough ready and assemble it on the site. And that's an early image with the misting system. There's a misting system in it which cools the building. The plants grow on hydroponic trays, so it's drip irrigation, which is very economical. But there are different locations for this misting system, because different plants can take different amounts of water. And so it keeps the building cool. It's for effect. You humidify it and then let the air come in. We couldn't get a LEED certificate because we didn't seal our windows and made everything 90% openable. And so we just decided to abandon that idea. Of course, now the Greha opens your mind to all of those other possibilities. And so this is when the plants sort of grow. You kind of get a drip when the misting is on, and the presence of the gardeners is what's very important. There are 20 gardeners who look after this facade. and the facade creates a kind of pattern on the walls. This is when we filmed this just after it was finished, but that's the outside world, which maybe visually you don't even want to sort of engage with. So, it grows into a hairy monster, then you've got to give it a haircut, it goes back, it grows, it's sort of very dynamic. It's sort of just a wraparound, but it's a performative skin. It's not just aesthetic. And it sits on a podium, and here you see it sort of misting. It's sectionally also modulated to extract hot air. It creates social spaces that people can use. It blooms at different moments. People make friends with the gardeners to get bouquets to give to a wife or a husband on an anniversary because they've forgotten to buy it. There are many things on their blog that are very interesting. Lots of lemongrass to keep the mosquitoes away. And these sort of spaces are organized by program. The tender department is the only one that doesn't have a double height because that's secretive. The rest is all sort of modulated. And my friend Sanjay Prakash urged me to start controlling or mapping the temperature. And we've started doing that. And that building got a LEED certificate. And so, one makes you wonder what this all sort of means. And I come back to this image. And again, Sanjay Prakash was the one who said to me, he said, what you've done is created true green jobs. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, the poorest people in this company, which are the 20 gardeners, are empowered because the identity of the project now depends on them. And the fact that they can roam in such adjacency to the bosses is incredible. And that's what Marty Chen's quote, when I read it, it felt like, my God, it resonated because it was really about getting the less powerful. And so this kind of thing one learns becomes a challenge. So in a cafeteria, can you expose the production more, that people who are actually toiling and cooking in some ways are making contact with the people they're serving? It's invisible. In our society, all of that is really invisible. And it made me learn from this building and Sanjay Prakash's comments that I think architecture can play a big role in modulating spatially access in ways that people can connect with each other. And this woman wouldn't have been wearing a sari. An intern from my office took this image. It's not even a staged image, to be very honest with you. So it's quite incredible that that can happen. And they're the true heroes or the makers of the building because the building really sort of depends on them. And this coexistence, I think, is quite beautiful. We extended this in some bizarre ways in a project we did, our first project in Europe. And it's in Basel on the Rhine. It's for a company called Novartis. This is a campus they have. They patronize architecture. It's a very straight grid. We are on the river. Ours was the first building on the Rhine. It's a grid, and then they got left with one triangular site. You can see it there, and they gave it naturally to Frank Gehry. So he built his sort of building there. But it's a campus where they're really interested in architecture. And so this was what we came up with. What was interesting is there are 20 buildings on the campus which are high-tech laboratories, and every architect from Europe and America followed that paradigm, which is two large aggregated cores, because that's what they were given. Because in the West, the obsession with the facade and with the skin of the building, again, this is what capital has done and legislation has done, because people are so scared they'll get sued that you just go with the facade. It can be done very quickly and capital can be realized. And we began to challenge that. And I suppose when you're an architect in Bombay, you challenge any bylaw. And so we thought that if you disaggregated the cores and you moved them to the edges, like you do in a kitchen often in triangulating it, you actually get a floor plate that's open. Because in that floor plate, you have the labs between the two cores and the offices on the side, and there's a caste system and a hierarchy created because the office managers get the views and the poor scientists sit between these cores toiling away on research. So we said by opening it up, we would get a footprint. The second thing we did was everyone uses 5 meters as the height. And we said for the offices, you don't need 5 meters, you need 8 feet, which is 2.4 meters. So we got 5 floors on one side, and we got 4 floors on the other side, which gave us the FSI or the extra amount to carve out a large courtyard in the center. So we got a section which had a large atrium courtyard, which was green. You had offices, you had half levels, much like the CEPT library that I showed you, and you had great communication, in a sense, between the researchers and the office workers. And we had a skin in green there, a veranda where the scientists could go and write up their research sitting amidst nature. And so This is done by Gunther Woh, which is the garden. He's a Swiss landscape architect. And he came up with 28 species to register the temperature of the seasons in Switzerland. So sometimes it burns, brown, blooms at different months. He sort of calibrated that, which was very interesting. And so that's what the building sort of looks like. The Rhine side has blinds which go down. They're automated. These were all up because it was twilight. And it sits across. That's a building by Marquis, which is this white glass. So it sort of is very much a contrast. That's concrete, which mixes the stone from Basel, so you get a particular patina in the concrete. It's exposed concrete. And so this is the ground floor. You see labs through this curve. As you come up, you go through the staircase. The labs are visible. This is just the ground floor, so there was more limitations here. That's an installation by an artist called Pipolotti Rist, who took what she saw in the microscopes of the scientists and made abstract art. And this is video installations through the building. And in a cold day in the winter, when you walk through this, you get washed with color, and people enjoy that. They actually walk through these installations because the warmth just of the color is very beautiful. And you see these installations move all around in contrast. And on the upper levels, you have the courtyard with the offices. The garden comes right. That's the office. It's all open. The garden actually comes into the office, and you see different levels, which are meeting rooms, etc., which are all around the gardens. Or look at those are labs. But then outside every lab, you're in the garden. So office workers, researchers have spaces to meet. And it's a number of half levels, so it becomes much more social because people can climb only half a flight and they go into someone's office or into a research lab. And when you sit in the garden, you're lost because it encompasses you completely. There's screens here that you can have meetings, you can have Skype calls, you can be sitting in the garden and doing this. There are large skylights which create a greenhouse effect, so it also works with the climatic dimensions. It's got geothermal heating. It's got all the things that meet zero. And you see the screens, so these become places that people meet. And you see the relation to the labs. Those are decks which are meeting rooms. So it's very loose. And from the labs, you see the offices and the river. So it creates a completely different connection. Because we moved the cores, we got a big footprint where we could do that. And as you walk through the building, there's a lot of porosity. And that's the facade. And that's how it closes. I'm going to just end with two projects which now bring in a kind of social dimension. And I want to start by sort of using a quote from Pratap Bhanu Mehta, which I came across. And here, you know, the client, the patron, sometimes the patron doesn't exist, sometimes the client, the user exists, but the client doesn't exist. And so these are about self-initiated projects. I mean, the NGO sector, civil society, often this is something that's, the need of the hour in a sense. And I think there are wicked problems which make it even more important for us to look at. And Pratap Bhanu Mehta, I quote him, he said, "In a society riven by deep inequality, there's not even the minimal basis for mutual concern, where social distance makes human beings almost a different species in each other's eyes. Why would you expect anything else? Why would a contractor care if one of his construction workers used his hands rather than a brush to apply a dangerous chemical? The more inequality there is, the harder it is to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. It has to be admitted that even the most well-meaning and sensitive find it hard to imagine what the suffocation, darkness, and sheer physical suffering of being at the bottom of the social hierarchy might really be like. The very thing you would expect to instigate questions of justice makes it hard to even raise them." And I think this is very important because really you can be paralyzed into inaction, but then what's the moral right not to act? And in this condition, the truth is that we all come from a upper middle kind of background where maybe sometimes parts of society become abstract in the way that Pratap Bhanu Mehta describes them. And so the question is, it's not an issue that we can avoid, but how do we sort of deal with it? And we've been sort of very interested in this question of sanitation, which through Spark and Sheila Patel, I began to sort of engage with in trying to find what is the agency of design here. And, you know, I took this image, I always say this, I'm sorry if some of you have heard this story. I took this image accidentally. I took 40 images that day when I had gone to Dharavi, and I came back, and when I downloaded this, I thought of my own children, because I thought this kid wearing clean white socks, a white shirt, a smile on his face, is going to school, but has defecated in the open before he went to for his day. And that's sort of the reality. But how intact he is, and what does that mean? And, you know, open defecation, of course, now it's become central to the imagination in India. But this is something we were doing 5 or 7 years ago. One got interested then. And you know, how can you think about this differently? And of course, we got into a research project looking at what open defecation meant, the statistics, looking particularly at Mumbai. And then, of course, it's mind-boggling because the BMC target, so in Mumbai has one toilet for 1,440 people. The BMC's target is 1:50. So which means 6 families will share a toilet, which means every morning you'll have a lottery. So you're lucky once in a month you might be able to use the toilet. So as a society, even to have an aspiration like this is so crazy. And that's why our Prime Minister, Narendra Modi's, you know, mission to change this is absolutely critical. I mean, I think it's one of the most important things because the implication on public health and many other things is very critical. And constructing every toilet in every household by 2019, it's like a mind-boggling idea. And so, of course, it becomes political rhetoric. Everyone jumps at it. But we don't really find the solution. You know, it's 1.5 years away, 2 years away maybe. I mean, are we going to find the solution? Are we going to find the solution for every house having a toilet? They're different. This can't be universalized as problems. They're very localized problems. In the villages, you're mass producing and throwing a toilet outside everyone's house. And as studies have shown, they become used for storage, for granary, because it's the most pakka thing in the village. So maybe the culture will change. And from Renana, I've been talking to her about this. And, you know, cohesion, people are being forced into this. There's a kind of more forceful way to change these cultures. People are photographing people who are defecating in the open. In Bihar, there was a protest of teachers who were upset about this. So where do we draw the lines? How do we construct and shift culture? And I think the question for us as designers is space, and the imagination of architecture can play a role. Because these are what I would call absolute solutions. Like housing, we want to provide 20 million houses in the next 10 to 5 years or whatever. That's an absolute solution, and you can't solve everything with absolute solutions. That's okay when you're talking about this as politics. So we need transitions before transformation. So the question of transitions, how do you design for transitions, I think is another major challenge for planners and architects in our pedagogy too, because we otherwise are always designing absolute solutions. And that's why this links to what I'm talking about in ephemeral urbanism, is that should permanence be a default condition? We take permanence as a default condition. We don't design a weekend house to be recycled in 10 years. We design it should last 100 years. And conservation only reinforces that narrative. So how do you make these balances is very critical. And so these are the public toilets that were being done. So we got involved with Spark. We came up with a prototype, got it off the grid, added a community center with a caretaker's house. We did this toilet. It stopped at the plinth level because the government said, Nani, this is too iconic. I said, my God, iconic? This is a toilet? They said, no, it's too iconic because we've talked to a developer and we are removing those slums and we are building buildings. So what's the point of putting a toilet? You're putting a community center. They'll organize themselves and they'll protest. And so it'll ruin our project. So we can't let you have. So we kept doing this till we went to a remote location. You know, talk about impatient capital. I was an impatient architect who told Sheila Patel, let's build one. We find a place where they won't go, where the roads are very bad and no municipal engineer will go. So we built this and it turned out to be rather beautiful. Kids used it. They're studying. That's public housing that hasn't been occupied for 15 years because it's an absolute solution. The people in the slum prefer living there. They use this public toilet. The solar panels were on. And then I went back 7 months later, and the government had put a new toilet. This had failed. A local politician who was a contractor had taken it over. They had made it a club. They watched TV. There's a TV there. There are rum bottles. Cricket was watched there. It was a complete disaster. So, of course, Beckett ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. And so we did this competition for the Gates Foundation, which was actually run by an NGO in Delhi, whose name I will not use, but we won the competition. It was an international competition. When we came to meet them in Delhi to say, look, let's build this, they said, it took too long to do the competition. We appointed the contractor for 500 toilets. We're building that old standard style. It was faster. So again, we sort of lost. And here what we did was we tried to embed it as infrastructure. We said it should completely demolish the idea of what a toilet is. And so there's a little shop that sells things for sanitation. We said you could have a laundromat in it. You could have a community space. It's in steel. It's reversible. When the problem is solved in that settlement through upgradation, maybe this is recycled and moved to another location. So then they become transitionary problems. You don't make absolute solutions or make permanent slums. And we also provocatively put it across from the temple, which might not have been a good idea. So sanitation is complex. It's physical, social, cultural, and it's an ecology. And one can't solve it singularly. And so again, I think designers have to step into this space, because what is happening in the business as usual model is not going to, for us as a society, help us find those solutions. So I'm flagging this out as a challenge. And I'll just end with this, which is what Renana was talking about, my new clients. And this has been actually going on for 14 years. It was a competition. Here the patrons, the clients, the users have nothing to do with each other. The patron is the chief minister who comes and goes, and if you have a good moment, you get things done. The clients are changing entities, PWD, Tourism, Amber Development Authority. Every month somebody changed. And the users are the only stable ones, which are the elephants and the mahouts. So we had to deal with all three of them. And of course, Jaipur, it has this imagination. These elephants shouldn't be here in a desert climate because they're tropical beings. They take tourists up. They go rogue in the summer when they get hot. That paint discolors their skin. It's problematic. That's what the government had for them. Cars, garages with people living above. The complex relationship between a mahout and an elephant is something worth discerning. And so one has to create spatially an intimacy. The site we got was what the sand quarry contractors had taken out, the sand, and it was just a series of depressions. We did calculations, we found what we needed in terms of water, and we made it a landscape project. We said the architecture wasn't important. If you didn't have the water to create a condition for these elephants and their being, there's no point doing architecture. So it became a landscape project with micro dams. That was the site when we got it. That was the plan. So the housing came in the interstitial spaces, and that sort of evolved. And so in March 2007, when we first went to site, that's what it looked like. That's the same hill. And you can see how in 10 years it's transformed completely because of we held out. Now, we were lucky that once the PWD didn't have a tender item for the water body, but we managed to dig it out through excavators. The housing was done because that's what people are wanting to build quickly for various reasons. And the government fell, so the new government didn't want to touch the project, which was great for us in retrospect. When it happened, I was frustrated, I cried. But in retrospect, it allowed the place to regenerate itself because the water was being held. And so the local species flourished. And then by the time we went back there, you can see the same hill. They're taken from the same spot. It transformed totally. For the housing too, we paid attention. We created, it's only 400 square feet housing, it's EWS housing, but we created a series of courtyards, so people had expanded spaces, a barsati, a larger courtyard, so if 3 families got together, they had a mansion. And so we sort of did that, and these are sort of drawings, ventilation, using the hay of the elephants to insulate the than. Elephants are of different sizes. They can't sleep on flat ground because then they can't get up, so you had to slope them. So this is a site visit trying to do mock-ups. And for the architects, it might be fun to hear that when I do a book on this, I'm going to call it large, medium, small, extra large, and all that. So this is what it looked like when it was just finished. The first water body, Amber, is where they go to work. The thans transform depending on who occupies it. These are the elephants and the children. So we created these kinds of relationship. That's a mahout coming home. It's a completely different intimacy that they have, not only with the beast, but also with their own families. And so while the middle class in Jaipur have to get tankers of water, here these guys have more water than they need. So they grow flowers, they sell flowers, they have lawns, which every middle class person would want to aspire for, which you can't do in a place like Jaipur. But this is what the thans look like. Some thans weren't allocated when governments fell, so these neem trees have grown now beautifully just by default because no one touched it. Life begins to corrode architecture. People move in. The courtyards get used for kitchens. The goats move in. You can see the trees thing. The dish antennas have come. It's like a forest in parts now. Just transformed because we really privileged the landscape because we said the environment was important here. Kikad, then the government, someone in the government said, okay, budget for retaining walls. So we did retaining walls. That happened. Then they are social beings. So we had to make these common thans. Where, for 2 hours they hang out together. Because if they don't hang out together, they get like really anxious. So they started hanging out together for a couple of hours. Then there was a group of teenagers who were the Mahout's children, who saw this as an opportunity for entrepreneurship. So they created a company called Elephantastic, and they had a website, and you could book a bath with the elephant for 500 rupees, or you could get photographed, or you could feed the elephant, and so they made a business out of it. So another generation made a business. And now, none of this was intentional, but in retrospect, what I think we did by default was created an armature for life, because we privileged not the architecture, and that was very hard to do, because one realized that this was more important. And I just recently did a mapping, and it's very interesting. So what you see in red is RMA Architects. We were involved for the 12 years. In between, just when this last government was elected, we tried reaching out, but they didn't get interested in the project. So you see us going less to site. But at our own cost, we went to site for 10 years. And below that, you see the agencies who keep changing. And the last one shows you Congress, Congress, and BJP. So BJP initiated this, and the Congress came, in its many avatars in between, and now the BJP has come back. And what's very interesting is this is a mapping, you'll see in this video, of the letters I wrote. I wrote about 200 letters. I would write a letter every month to whoever the chief minister was. And then finally, in January, earlier this year, here you see we have no attachment. I'm writing to Vasundhara Raje, writing. And then I get a call from her when she thought the timing was right. And we went, and I'm happy to announce that 2 weeks ago, they actually inaugurated it, and it had been abandoned for many, many years. And so now it's getting finished. These are images from a month ago, but now it's all been finished. The pens, those will all become green walls. Those are the common thans with water bodies. It's sort of all cleaned up. These are areas now for tourists with trees where people can sit and watch the elephants bathe. New infrastructure. We work with Mohan Rao, who's a landscape architect and ecologist, so he's helped us do all of this. The grasses will be filled into the retaining walls. This has all been planted last month. Those are the common thans, which are all over the place now, so elephants can make pals and hang out together. And now, we also introduced other amenities like a guest house, just 4 rooms that people can go and live there and experience life there. Now, these were suggested by us as we saw the need, and when we found patronage for it, it got built. So it's very simple materials, but it gives them an income. Their guest house is just around the courtyard. The Mahout's wives are going to run this guest house and cook, and so they get an income, so like those teenagers. Now this becomes an instrument for giving them employment. This is someone from the forest department doing training programs with them. The convicts of the local jail, on the suggestion of the Mahouts and the government, made all the furniture for the complex. So they've built all the furniture. Now artists or people have started decorating their homes because there's more attention, and the paths have been done. And suddenly, in the last 6 months, it's sort of evolved into a kind of finishing, although it's not yet done. Some parts, which are the lowest, are like forest because the water settles there in the monsoon and it just grows. There's another generation, so now we are restoring some broken buildings into a school for these kids who are the younger kids, because with 100 families there, you will have many kids. I'm just going to take a minute to summarize, and I'll just say that working in Mumbai, for me, I use that emblematically because it's a city that I think I've learned from, is about negotiating global flows so as not to erase and remake landscapes, but rather to occupy local fissures to create, I think, fascinating hybrid conditions and dealing with these startling adjacencies. For me, in retrospect, that's been inspirational about working in Mumbai. The design challenge in this condition depends on how to make these disparate worlds blur. Can the thresholds between them be spatially softened? As a practitioner, social access and its clear relationship to the articulation of spatial arrangements becomes a critical aspect of design. This is not about the city of the rich or the poor, or the regular models, or the formal and the informal, or many such other binaries which are very useful to explain conditions, but not always productive to create synthesis. Because it's about this kinetic space where these descriptive concepts collapse into a singular entity, and where meanings are ever shifting and blurred. The question for architects, conservationists, urban designers, planners then becomes, can we design for this space of blur? Can we design with a divided mind? And more importantly, how might we be inspired by the design intelligence of the ephemeral, of the kinetic, of the landscapes that we see evolving around us, the notion of flux, and how can we positively turn it to our advantage? And how can we then, as designers and activists, act on our own localities? Can we use design to construct soft thresholds that facilitate porosity both socially and spatially? The highly pluralistic environment of Indian landscapes requires planning, I believe, attitudes and design mechanisms that continually negotiate between the differences in architecture as the sole instrument of placemaking and the temporality that creates the conditions of habitation and celebrations. It must include the state and the market, the empowered and the poor, rather than allow one entity to prevail and remake the city in its image. This is what makes working, for me in Mumbai, emblematically in the landscape of India, unique, challenging. Here, extreme differences exist in very close proximity, in your face, as we all know, not distant or abstract. A pluralistic society is one that not only accepts differences, but also goes beyond to understand and even be influenced by it in productive ways. That is to see the simultaneous validity of difference. Because once the architect and the planner and the landscape architect and the conservationist sees these various differences as being simultaneously valid, the challenge is how do you go beyond these polarized binaries through the making of architecture, of soft thresholds and spaces that are visually and physically porous, plural in spirit and expression, and most critically encompassing truly of the context. And for me, this is the aspiration of our practice. Thank you very much.